My name is Nathaniel Brooks. I'm 35 years old and I own a cattle ranch a few miles outside Livingston, Montana. Most people around here know me as a quiet man. The kind who fixes his own fences, keeps his word, and doesn't ask anyone for help. They weren't always right. There was a time when this ranch was full of laughter. My wife, Sarah, used to sing while making breakfast every morning. She believed a home should wake up before the sun did. Even the ranch hands smiled more when she was around. Then 3 years ago, a fever swept through the valley. Within 5 days, she was gone. The doctor called it bad luck. The preacher called it God's plan. To me, it just felt like the world had forgotten to keep turning. The cattle still needed feeding. The horses still needed shoeing. The fences still broke after every storm. Life never stopped, even when mine did. Every morning I climbed into the saddle before sunrise and worked until dark. Every evening I came home to an empty kitchen. Sometimes I cooked beans. Sometimes I burned bacon. Most nights, I didn't bother eating at all. The ranch hands noticed, but nobody said anything. Cowboys aren't good at talking about loneliness. We simply work harder and pretend it doesn't exist. One Sunday after church, Reverend Collins stopped me outside the chapel. "Nathaniel," he said, "when was the last time someone cooked you a proper meal?" I laughed. "I don't remember." He didn't laugh back. "A man can survive alone," he said quietly, "but a house can't." Those words stayed with me longer than I expected. A few days later, I walked into the newspaper office in town and paid for a tiny advertisement. It wasn't long. Cook wanted, Brooks Ranch, honest work, room and board included, no romance, no marriage, employment only. I underlined those last 2 words, employment only. The women at church had spent the last 3 years trying to introduce me to every widow within 50 miles. I wasn't looking for another wife. I simply wanted someone who knew the difference between burnt biscuits and edible ones. For nearly 3 weeks, nobody answered. Then, late one windy October afternoon, I heard the sound of a stagecoach climbing the hill toward my ranch. I stepped onto the porch. The driver climbed down first. Then he reached back inside. I expected to see an older woman, maybe someone in her 50s. Instead, a young woman carefully stepped onto the dirt road. She wore a faded blue dress covered with travel dust. Her boots were worn thin. She looked exhausted, but what caught my attention wasn't her. It was the little girl sleeping peacefully in her arms. The child couldn't have been more than a year old, wrapped inside a patched wool blanket. She rested against the woman's shoulder as if the whole world were safe. The woman walked toward me slowly. "You must be Mr. Brooks." "I am." She offered a tired smile. "My name is Emily Carter. I came about the cooking position." I looked at the baby, then back at her. "I'm afraid you've misunderstood the advertisement." She frowned slightly. "No, sir, I read every word. I know exactly what you asked for." I folded my arms. "And the baby?" Emily gently kissed the little girl's forehead. "My daughter, Rose." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The wind pushed dry leaves across the yard. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses stamped its hoof against the floor. Finally, I sighed. "I don't think this is the right place for a child." Emily lowered her eyes. "I understand." She turned as if she were already preparing to leave, then she stopped. Without looking back, she spoke so quietly I almost didn't hear her. "Please, just give me 1 week. If my cooking isn't worth the trouble, I'll leave on my own. I won't ask for another chance." Her voice wasn't begging, it sounded defeated, like someone who had already heard no too many times. Just then little Rose opened her eyes. She looked straight at me, reached one tiny hand into the air, and smiled. It was such a small thing, a baby smiling at a stranger. But after 3 years of silence, it felt like the first warm sunrise after a brutal winter. I stepped aside from the doorway. 1 week. Emily looked up, surprised. 1 week, I repeated. "If it doesn't work, you leave." Tears filled her eyes, but she nodded before they could fall. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks," as she carried little Rose across my front porch. I told myself this was only temporary. She was just the cook, nothing more. I had no way of knowing that the woman carrying that little girl into my home was also carrying a secret powerful enough to change every remaining year of my life. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the hallway, then came bacon, coffee, and something sweet I couldn't quite place for 3 years. That kitchen had smelled like burnt beans and loneliness. Now, it smelled like home. I walked downstairs quietly. Emily was already working. She had tied her sleeves above her elbows, flour dusted across her hands. Little Rose sat in a wooden basket near the fireplace, happily chewing on a wooden spoon while watching her mother move around the kitchen. Emily looked up and smiled politely. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks. I hope you don't mind, I started a little early." I glanced at the table, fresh biscuits, eggs, bacon, homemade jam, even the old coffee pot looked happier. I didn't know all this was possible in my kitchen. She laughed softly. "I found your flour hidden behind 3 sacks of beans." I scratched my beard. I forgot it was there. I noticed. The ranch hands arrived a few minutes later. Big Tom took one bite of the biscuits. His eyes nearly popped out. "Boss," he looked at me in complete disbelief. "Are we celebrating something?" Before I could answer, Emily placed another basket of warm bread on the table. "No celebration," she said, "just breakfast." Every man asked for seconds. Even quiet Samuel, who usually finished eating without saying a single word, looked at Emily and smiled. "Ma'am, I haven't eaten this well since my mother passed." Emily simply nodded. "I'm glad you liked it." For the first time in years, breakfast wasn't silent. Men laughed, told stories, argued about horses. The house finally sounded alive again. Over the next several days, Emily worked harder than anyone I'd ever met. She never complained. Never wasted food. She stretched every dollar further than I thought possible. She repaired old curtains instead of buying new ones. She planted wildflowers beside the porch using seeds she'd carried in her travel bag. Even the ranch hands started cleaning up after themselves, mostly because they didn't want to disappoint her. Little Rose became everyone's favorite visitor. The old stable dog followed her everywhere. The horses lowered their heads whenever she giggled. Even my oldest gelding, a grumpy animal that disliked nearly everyone, allowed Rose to pat his nose. Big Tom laughed one afternoon. "Boss, I think that baby's already running the ranch." I tried to keep my distance. Emily was my employee, nothing more. Every evening I reminded myself of that, but every morning, she somehow made it harder to believe. One afternoon, I returned from repairing a broken fence. I found Emily sitting on the porch sewing one of my old work shirts. "I was going to throw that away," I said. She looked up. "It still has good fabric. Seems wasteful." I watched her needle move carefully through the cloth. "My wife used to sew." Emily stopped for just a second. "I'm sorry. So am I." Neither of us spoke again. Some silences didn't need filling. A few nights later, a cold rainstorm rolled across the valley. The wind shook every window in the house. Around midnight, I heard someone crying, not loudly, softly, almost trying not to be heard. I followed the sound upstairs. Emily sat beside Rose's small bed. The little girl was burning with fever. Emily held a damp cloth against her forehead, tears quietly running down her cheeks. "I can't get it to come down," she whispered. "I've tried everything." Without saying another word, I grabbed my coat. The nearest doctor lived almost 12 miles away. Most people would have waited until morning. I didn't. The rain turned the roads into mud. Lightning split the sky as I rode through the darkness. By the time I reached town, the doctor's office was closed. I pounded on his door until he answered. Within an hour, I was riding back with medicine strapped inside my saddlebag. Rose's fever finally began to fall just before sunrise. Emily looked completely exhausted. She stood and handed me the empty medicine bottle. "I don't know how to thank you." I shook my head. "You don't." She looked at me with tired eyes. "You rode through that storm for someone you've only known a week." I looked toward little Rose sleeping peacefully. "No child deserves to suffer alone." Emily smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just enough to light up her face. For reasons I couldn't explain, my chest felt strangely warm. A few days later, the doctor returned to check on Rose. After examining her, he smiled. "She'll be just fine." As he packed his bag, he looked at Emily, then at me. "You've got yourself a good little family here, Nathaniel." Emily's cheeks immediately turned red. I opened my mouth to correct him, but the words never came because for the first time since Sarah died, the thought didn't feel impossible. It felt comforting. I didn't know it then. But someone else had already noticed the happiness returning to Brooks Ranch, and that man intended to destroy it. By the time November arrived, Brooks Ranch no longer felt like the lonely place it had been. The kitchen stayed warm. The ranch hands laughed again. Little Rose had learned to wobble across the porch, holding onto anything she could reach. Sometimes, when I came back from checking the cattle, she'd stretch out both arms toward me. Without thinking, I'd pick her up. She'd grab my beard, laugh, and somehow erase the worst part of my day. I kept telling myself not to get attached, but I already was. One Saturday morning, I rode into Livingston for supplies. The general store was crowded. While I waited for my order, I noticed two men reading an old newspaper nailed to the wall. One of them pointed toward a faded notice. "You remember that Carter fellow?" The other man nodded. "The one accused of robbing the First National Bank. They never caught him alive. He died before the trial. What a shame. They said his poor wife disappeared with the baby." My hands froze. Carter, Emily Carter. My heart suddenly felt much heavier than the sack of flour I was carrying. That afternoon, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Maybe it was another Carter, maybe not. I told myself I shouldn't jump to conclusions. Still, the name refused to leave my mind. 2 days later, the answer came to my front door. A black wagon rolled into the ranch yard. 3 men stepped out. One wore a sheriff's badge. The other 2 carried rifles. Emily was hanging laundry outside. The moment she saw them, the color disappeared from her face. She whispered only one word, "No." The sheriff removed his hat politely. "Mrs. Emily Carter," she nodded slowly. "We need to ask you a few questions regarding your late husband." The ranch hands stopped working. Everyone watched. I walked across the yard. "What's this about?" The sheriff unfolded an old wanted poster. The paper was worn and stained from weather. Across the top, in bold black letters, "Wanted for bank robbery." Below it was the picture of a young man. The name underneath read, "Daniel Carter." Emily closed her eyes. Rose clung tightly to her mother's dress. The sheriff sighed. "We're reopening several old cases. A witness recently claimed your husband hid stolen money before he died. If that's true, the property could be searched." One of the deputies looked around my ranch. "If stolen money is found here, it becomes evidence." I felt every pair of eyes turn toward Emily. One of the ranch hands muttered, "I knew something wasn't right." Another quietly stepped away from her. Emily's shoulders trembled. Then she looked directly at me. "Nathaniel, my husband wasn't a thief." Her voice cracked. "He was innocent." I wanted to believe her. I truly did. But the wanted poster, the sheriff, the investigation, none of it looked fake. I asked the hardest question I'd ever spoken. "Emily, why didn't you tell me?" Tears rolled down her cheeks. "Because no one ever believes me. They see the poster, and that's the end of the story." The sheriff spoke gently. "We're not arresting you, but until we finish investigating, you shouldn't leave the county." He handed her a folded document. Then the wagon slowly disappeared down the road. Silence settled over the ranch, the kind of silence I thought I'd buried years ago. That evening, Emily packed her few belongings. I found her folding Rose's tiny clothes into an old suitcase. "What are you doing?" She didn't look at me. "I'm leaving." I stared at her. "You still have 6 months left on your contract." She smiled sadly. "I know, but your men don't trust me anymore. The town never will. I won't let my past destroy your ranch." Rose looked up at me with confused little eyes. She didn't understand why her mother was crying. I looked around the room, the warm kitchen, the repaired curtains, the flowers outside the window. Every bit of life in this house had come from Emily. Finally, I spoke. "I hired you because I needed a cook." I stepped closer, but somewhere along the way, you became family. Emily slowly raised her eyes. "I'm not asking you to trust your husband's name. I'm asking you to trust mine." She broke down crying. For the first time, I gently placed my hand on her shoulder. "You and Rose aren't going anywhere. If someone wants to prove you're guilty, they'll have to convince me first." Emily whispered through her tears, "Thank you," but neither of us realized someone in town was smiling because the sheriff's visit had been exactly what he wanted, and before the week was over, that man would come to Brooks Ranch, claiming he finally had proof that Emily Carter had been living a lie. The very next afternoon, a black carriage rolled into my ranch yard. The man who stepped down introduced himself with a smile that never reached his eyes. Harlan Whitmore. He removed his gloves slowly. "I believe we have some unfinished business concerning Mrs. Carter." Emily went pale the moment she saw him. Rose immediately hid behind her mother's skirt. "That told me everything." "You know him?" I asked. Emily nodded, barely. "He loaned money to Daniel before he died." Harlan chuckled. "Loaned? That's one way to describe it." He reached into his leather case and placed several papers on my porch railing. "Your cook's late husband owed me nearly $2,000. He signed every page." Emily stepped forward. "That's a lie. My husband borrowed less than $200. You changed those papers." Harlan smiled calmly. "Can you prove it?" Emily said nothing because she couldn't. He looked at me. "Mr. Brooks, I've already spoken with the sheriff. If Mrs. Carter can't repay this debt, I'll be forced to claim everything legally attached to her." He glanced around my ranch. "Since she's living here, that could become rather complicated." I folded the papers without reading another line. "You can leave now." His smile faded. "You should think carefully. I'm giving you a chance to protect your ranch." I stepped closer until we were standing face to face. "I'm protecting it by asking you to leave." For a second, I thought he might swing at me instead. He simply tipped his hat. "You'll regret this." Then he climbed back into his carriage. That evening, I rode into town. Something about those papers bothered me. They looked too clean, too perfect, as if someone had written yesterday instead of 3 years ago. I stopped at the courthouse. The old clerk remembered Daniel Carter immediately. After nearly an hour of searching, he found the original loan record. I stared at the page. The amount wasn't $2,000, it was $187, exactly what Emily had said. Someone had added an extra zero, then forged new documents. The clerk frowned. "That's not Daniel's signature either. I've seen it dozens of times. This one's fake." My stomach tightened. "Harlan," the old clerk nodded slowly. "He's been cheating honest people for years, but nobody's ever caught him. Until now." 3 days later, the courtroom in Livingston was packed. Nearly everyone in town came. Some expected Emily to lose, others simply wanted a good show. Harlan stood confidently beside his lawyer. He smiled every time he looked at us, right up until I handed the judge the original courthouse records. The clerk testified. The signatures were different. The amounts had been changed. The ink on Harlan's documents was years newer than the originals. One by one, every lie fell apart. Then came the final blow. The retired bank cashier testified that Daniel Carter had repaid most of the loan before his death. Harlan had hidden the receipt. The courtroom became silent. The judge looked directly at Harlan. "You forged legal documents. You attempted to steal property through fraud. I'll be referring this matter for criminal prosecution." For the first time, Harlan looked afraid. Deputies escorted him from the courtroom. Emily covered her face and cried, not because she was sad, because after 3 long years, her husband's name had finally been cleared. Spring arrived early that year. The snow melted. Wildflowers returned to the hills. Brooks Ranch felt alive in every possible way. One evening, I found Rose taking her first confident steps across the porch. She stumbled straight toward me without thinking. I caught her. She wrapped both tiny arms around my neck. Then she looked into my eyes and said one small word, "Papa." Everything inside me stopped. Emily had heard it too. She stood in the doorway with tears filling her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never taught her that." I smiled. "I know." Rose rested her head on my shoulder as if she'd done it 1,000 times before. I looked at Emily. "I placed an advertisement asking for a cook." I laughed softly. I was very specific. No romance, no family, no second chances. Emily smiled through her tears. And yet, I reached for her hand. God ignored every word I wrote. A tear rolled down her cheek. "So," I asked quietly, "what do you think about staying here?" not as my cook, but as my wife. Emily didn't answer right away. She simply stepped closer, laid her hand in mine, and nodded. Sometimes the life you're praying for doesn't arrive the way you planned sometimes. It steps off a dusty stagecoach, carrying a tired smile and a little girl who changes your heart forever. I asked for a cook. God sent me a family.